I want to talk about the Book of Psalms real quick, because I made this whole picture of the Book of Psalms, and because the Book of Psalms is really, really interesting. And the primary reason that the Book of Psalms is interesting is because the Book of Psalms is the only book of the Bible that was divided into chapters when it was written. And what that means, if you don't understand what I'm saying, is that the other books of the Bible, they were the chapters and verses that you see in the Bible today, they don't come around until the 13th century for chapters and the 16th century for verses. So that is a bit of an inaccurate statement. The Bible was divided into chapters and even verses before that time, but the chapters and verses were different. And they were different because, different local areas would divide the Bible in different ways according to their own ways of, reading the Bible for liturgical purposes. But the Book of Psalms is the only one where the authors themselves inserted chapter divisions, because the Book of Psalms is not actually a single work, but a collection of 150 Psalms. So the chapter divisions in the Book of Psalms are actually important, whereas they are a real secondary matter when dealing with other books of the Bible. I need to pause there for a second. So let's just talk about the Book of Psalms in general. So the Book of Psalms is divided into five books, which you can see right here. And the Psalms were written by quite a few different people. If you count, in terms of individual authors, there are about three, or when, so the authors of the Book of Psalms basically come in two different types of groups. There are individual authors like David, Asaph, Solomon, Moses, and these two guys named Heman and Ethan, who are called Ezrahites. And I'll talk about that later. Um, and, Hezekiah we'll get to later. That's an apocryphal psalm that he supposedly wrote. So there are these individual authors, but there is also a group that the sons of Korah that also wrote some of the Psalms. So you can see there are, in the original book of Psalms, there is five individual authors named. Six. Six. Sorry, six. I miscounted. David, Asaph, Solomon, Ethan, Heman, and Moses, and one group, the sons of Korah. And if you just look at the overview of the Book of Psalms, you can see kind of how how many of the Psalms each individual author wrote. I mean, it's kind of obvious. What's very notable is, of course, that of all the authors listed, David wrote most of the Psalms. Like, pretty much all of Book 1 is attributed to David. Pretty much all of Book 2, like a good portion of Book 2 is attributed to David. And, in Books 4 and 5, where it's not anonymous, it's generally attributed to David. So David has written a lot of the Psalms, but he's not the only one. You also have the sons of Korah, which wrote parts of Book 2 and Book 3. And you have Asaph, which he basically has an album in Book 3, and he also added a psalm in Book 2. Um, and those are the three main non-anonymous authors of the Book of Psalms. David, Asaph, and the sons of Korah. And, I'm not going to get into their Psalms in particular because what I want to talk about today is specifically the differences in authorship attribution and the the authors that it's attributed to do and the chapter divisions of the book of Psalms. Because if you'll notice here, I don't have one column to lay out the different chapters of the Psalms. I have two columns for each book. One has this word, these letters MAS on the top. That represents the Masoretic text. And the other, LXX, which is the Roman numeral for the number 70, that represents the Septuagint translation, which was supposedly written by 72 Jewish translators, a Greek translation of the book of Psalms, supposedly made by 72 translators, Jewish translators in the city of Alexandria. And if you'll note, these two versions are numbered differently. Don't worry about this over here. With the font that I was this is not like one's 50 and the other's 30. That's not what it's saying at all. Just ignore that for a second. That's not what it means. Anyways, and you'll note that in the two different versions of the book of Psalms, there is different psalms are attributed to different authors, and different psalms are combined and split apart. But both ultimately have 150 psalms. So let's talk about that and what that probably means real quick. First, I want to tell you first, let's list the three different views of the authorship of the book of Psalms to get an understanding. So let's first talk about authorship. So these different versions of the book of Psalms have different psalms attributed to different people. Most of them are the same. All the sons of Korah psalms are the same. All the Asaph psalms are the same. But the main difference is that some of the psalms that are anonymous in one version are attributed to David in the other version. This mostly goes in the direction of the Septuagint, viewing some psalms as being written by David that are labeled that are not given an author in the Masoretic text, but there are some cases like here in the Songs of Ascent where Psalm 122 and 124 are attributed to David in the Masoretic, but are left anonymous in the Septuagint. So essentially, the book, so that's one of the biggest differences. And you might think, okay, so there's some disagreement between the Septuagint and, let's say, the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition about whether or not certain Psalms were written by David. Okay, that's not really a conversation anyone has. It's just really an interesting fact. But if we want to look at the question of which Psalms were probably written by David, so there's some disagreement about which Psalms were written by David. So which Psalms were actually written by David? Is it the Masoretic list? Is it the Septuagint list? Or is it something different? Well, I am going to give you three different views on this. So there is three different views, generally speaking, on the authorship of the Psalms. The first view is somewhat archaic. You could say it's present in the is actually, uh, if I can get to Psalm 1. Okay. So the the three different views on who wrote the book of Psalms is pretty simple. There is the um I don't know how to say this. The patristic view, um the literal view, and the critical view. And there's a reason that I distinguish between the literal view and the patristic view, because you may think that if you're like just a traditional, if you're like a Protestant who believes that the Bible is historically inerrant, and you may look at the Book of Psalms, you may look at the authors that are attributed to each psalm and say that the authors listed under any particular psalm are the authors of that particular psalm. If no author is given, we don't know the author. If an author is given, that's who the author is. That is the literal view. The attributed authors are the authors. That is the literal view. And there are two different ways that this can be disagreed with. Of course, you have the critical view, and according to the critical view, all Psalms are anonymous. But there is actually a traditional patristic view that disagrees with this in the other direction, which says all of the Psalms were written by David. So if I were to have a third column here representing the um, who the different uh, who many of the church fathers, like Augustine specifically, would attribute, um, who Augustine would say wrote each of the Psalms, I would just color, I would have that column by here and color the whole thing blue. Because, yeah, many of the church fathers actually thought that David wrote all of the Psalms. And you may be confused by that and ask, why did they think that David wrote all the Psalms whenever their own Bibles explicitly stated that some of the Psalms were written by Asaph and some by the sons of Korah and some by Moses, etc., etc.? Well, the basic justification here for the claim that all of these Psalms are written by David is that um, all is basically the idea that David put other people's names on some of the Psalms because the theme of the psalm was fitting for that particular person. So these psalms for the sons of Korah, these psalms written by the sons of Korah, they have the names of the sons of Korah written on them, not because they were written by the sons of Korah, but because they were written for the sons of Korah. And same with the Psalms of Asaph, of Heman, and of Ezra. No, and of Ethan, sorry. And, he said Moses wrote this psalm not to give it some special authority, but because the theme of Psalm 90/89 fits Moses in some way. And he didn't just do this attributing it to past people and contemporaries. He also attributed some of the Psalms to people who didn't exist yet. Because you got to remember, these church fathers used the Septuagint translation. And if you'll note, in the Septuagint translation, two of the Psalms are attributed to prophets who lived long after the time of David. Psalm 64, which is 65 in the Masoretic, is attributed to Jeremiah and Ezekiel as well as David. In Psalm 145, which is 146 in the Masoretic, that is your modern Bible, are attributed to Haggai and Zechariah, the prophets of the return of the Second Temple period. Obviously, David, who died before the First Temple, could not have writ- written these. He couldn't not have written the 64th Psalm with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And Haggai and if the book of Psalms was written at the time of David, Haggai and Zechariah could not have written Psalm 145. So these church fathers who believed that the book of Psalms was entirely written at the time of David would argue that the book of Psalms was finished. No, would argue that David, with influenced by the prophetic spirit, added the names of these prophets um, because it would, you know, in order to achieve some mysterious purpose. Um, so, this view may sound very weird, but there is some basis for it if we look at Psalm 72 or Psalm 71. Because if you look at this Psalm, Psalm 71, you will note that the title does not actually say, in general, a psalm by Solomon or a psalm written from Solomon, but rather it's a psalm on Solomon or a psalm for Solomon. And whenever you read this psalm, you'll see how it is a psalm that appears to be written for Solomon rather than by him. So let's just start reading it. Give to the king thy judgment, O God, and to the king's son thy justice, to judge thy people with justice and thy poor with right judgment. Yes, it is the case that Solomon could have written that verse as a prayer, because we do see him praying for wisdom in the book of Kings, but it's also the case that, you know, King David, who we do read in the book of Kings, promised Bathsheba that Solomon would be his heir um, long before his death, could have written this in anticipation of Solomon being his heir, in a prayer for Solomon. Um, yeah, and then verse 4, but let's actually move down, uh, because we have verse 4 where it says, He shall judge the poor of the people, and he shall save the children of the poor, and he shall humble the oppressor. And there are other things that praise Solomon in this passage that is kind of self flattery, you could say, if Solomon was the one who wrote this. But if it is a father writing it for his son, then it's more prophetic, and also more, it's a greater expression of love. And also, importantly, this is the psalm that ends with the words, The praises of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. And this does appear to indicate that book 2 of that this psalm was also probably written by David. So we have this example of Psalm 71 being a psalm on Solomon, not a psalm by Solomon. However, another psalm is attributed to Solomon that was probably written by him, and that would be Psalm 127 in your modern Bibles. But here in the Douay-Rheims, it is 126, and we will get to that later, where it says a gradual canticle of Solomon, here in the Douay-Rheims. And it says, unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Unless the Lord keep the city, he watcheth in vain that keepeth it. It is vain for you to rise before light. Rise ye after you have sitten, you that eat the bread of sorrow, when he shall give sleep to his beloved. Behold, the inheritance of the Lord are children, the reward the fruit of the womb. As arrows in the hands of the mighty, so the children of them that have been shaken. Blessed is the man that hath filled the desire with them. He shall not be confounded when he shall speak to his enemies in the gate. So this psalm, um, the opening verse is, unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. That, I think, is a clear connection to the building of the temple. And the I think that's important because Solomon is the one to build the temple. Of course, David did also know that Solomon would build the temple. You see that in the Book of Kings. Um, but here, Solomon is the one who is. You can see how he might have written this, um, and for the temple that he was building. And I, you know, Solomon probably wrote some psalms himself. It's really not ridiculous that this could have been written by Solomon. But you could also see how it could be written by David for Solomon, because David knew that Solomon was going to build the temple. Now, I want to get onto the authorship of other psalms, because ultimately, though I do think that there is some merit to the patristic view, I ultimately agree with the literal view that if a psalm lists an author, it was probably written by the person, the psalm that is listed at the top of the psalm, rather than by, if it's not David, rather than by David himself. I don't think David literally wrote all of the psalms. Specifically, I don't think he wrote the Psalms of the sons of Korah or the Psalms of Asaph. And, let's look at those real quick. Psalm 42, and let's just look at their titles. So you have, for example, Psalm 41, and the Douay-Rheims, it says, for the sons of Korah. And then, okay, so I might have mislabeled Psalm 42 in the Septuagint. It says a psalm for David, for the sons of Korah, 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 and for the sons of Korah. So you'll see here in Book 2, you have Psalms for the sons of Korah and for Asaph. Maybe that means that David wrote them for his contemporaries, the sons of Korah and Asaph. But let's jump to Psalm 72 real quick. Okay, I'm pretty sure the Douay-Rheims is just listing all of these as for. You have here a psalm of Asaph rather than a psalm for. But if you actually read through the psalms, let's say the psalms of Asaph specifically, in this large block in Book 3, the psalms of Asaph in Book 3 really do have the character of, you know, I do think that Asaph himself wrote them because they are kind of a story of a soul. Um, they open up with his doubts about faith, and they seem to close with, you know, and as they continue on, you see a stronger and stronger expression of faith in God. And I am pretty sure that when it comes down to it, Asaph wrote all of these Psalms, um, and they weren't written for him, because I just don't see a. I just don't think there's a better person than Asaph himself to write pretty much his story and song. Um, and so I do think these Psalms of Asaph were written by Asaph. I don't think they were written by David. And that probably applies to the Psalms of Korah as well, of Heman and of Ethan. And I also think it's very. I just don't. And I just don't see why in the world David would have written Psalm 90, um, and then attribute it to Moses later. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't think that really flies. So I am of the literal view that the Psalms that say they were written by a particular person were written by that person, um, with obviously two exceptions that we have to talk about. Because, as I said, the Septuagint attributes two of the Psalms to prophets that lived long after the time of David. Jeremiah and Ezekiel attributed to Psalm 64, Haggai and Zechariah to Psalm 145. These makes no sense if we're thinking about the book of Psalms as something that was written during the reign of David. But specifically, Psalm 64 is attributed to David, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. That doesn't work as all of these being authors. But if let's just go to the actual psalm so we can read the attribution and see what it's actually saying. To the end, a psalm of David. So it's saying this psalm was authored by David. It's the canticle of Jeremiah and Ezekiel to the people of the captivity when they began to go out. So basically, um, this is a psalm. What that is saying here is that this is a psalm written by David, and it is a psalm that Jeremiah and Ezekiel used during their ministry to the people in captivity. So, what I want to do point out there is that the complicated way to explain this, the least simple way to explain this, is to say that David um, attributed this psalm to Jeremiah and Ezekiel so that they would later use it for the people of the captivity. And what's simpler to say is that, since the Septuagint translation, where this attribution comes from, was written after the time of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, that the Septuagint translators stated that it was written by David, and they also believed that it was important to include, as a historical note, the role that this psalm played in the ministry of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. That's the simplest literal way to understand this attribution. So we should not understand Psalm 64 as coming from a time later than David or being written by Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It is simply a psalm used by Jeremiah and Ezekiel during their ministry. And that use was inserted as a historical note in the Septuagint translation. A similar thing may then be said about Psalm 145, which is attributed to Haggai and Zechariah. It's probably the case that this was a psalm that was also written by David, though it is anonymous in the Masoretic text. But it was used um, by these prophets enough that it somehow became associated with them. And because the Septuagint translation was made after the time of Haggai and Zechariah, it makes sense that this attribution to Haggai and Zechariah could have been added to the psalm. Not because they wrote it, but because they used it so much. So, now that I've talked about this for a bit, I want to get to the big question of when the Psalms were written, because there are, of course, just there's three different views on this as well. The first view, the traditional view, is that the whole book of Psalms was written during the time of David. That is the traditional view, written during the time of David by David and or other authors. The second view is that books 1 through 2 and maybe 3 were written by David. I, well, the second view is that the book of Psalms was written during the time of David, but it was added to over time. Added to later. What this might look like is, as I was saying, you might believe that books 1 and book 2 are the original book of Psalms, and that book 3 was probably added to it during the reign of David, but that book 4 and book 5 could have been additions made at a later time. So those are that's what the second view is essentially saying. There is an original book of Psalms that's likely the first three books, and then for one reason or another, books 4 and 5, or some psalms in them were added later. So that's the second view. The third view is that it was all written in the Second Temple period, and that should be obvious. That's it should be obvious that that is the view of critical scholarship. I'm not considering that as like a real possible faithful view we can have about the Psalms. Um, I think if we say none of the Psalms were written by David, we're really just like that view exists to undermine the faith, so I don't take it seriously. Um, but, between the other two views, whether or not it was written during the time of David or written by David and added to later, the weirdness of the Septuagint version does lend credence to the second view. After all, if the Septuagint translators added things, added references to particular prophets in the book of Psalms, why couldn't it be the case that they that at other times books were added to the Psalms? Now, um, whenever it comes to what view do I take, I think both the first and second view are fine to hold, but as I explained earlier, the attributions to the prophets and the Septuagint aren't really evidence that these psalms were written at a later date. Um, they're just they can be easily explained and without relying on that. But striking those examples out, you may wonder, well, if these psalms were not written at a later date, if they were written during the time of David, well, what about the psalms written by the sons of Korah and by Asaph and by Ethan and by Heman? Well, I just need to point out real quick, we just need to go to First Chronicles, um, where all of these people are named. So this is First Chronicles 15. Oh, that's a good one. So First Chronicles 15, 19. Okay. So here we have, and David spoke to the chiefs of the Levites to appoint some of their brethren to be singers, with musical instruments, to wit, on psalteries and harps and cymbals, that the joyful noise might resound on high. And they appointed Levites, Heman the son of Joel, and of his brethren Asaph the son of Berechias, and the son of Merari, their brethren Ethan the son of Keziah. So what may so here we have Heman, Asaph, and Ethan all being named. And Ethan, Heman, Asaph, Solomon, these are the other authors that are individuals that are mentioned, that are contemporary to David, that are mentioned as authors of the book of Psalms. So the fact that these people are mentioned as authors to the book of Psalms, these relatively minor singers that happen to be in, you know, happen to be contemporaries of David, actually lends strength to the idea that this was written during the time of David. The fact that these are the first three people mentioned also lends significant credence to the idea that the book of Psalms was written at the time of David, as at least the first three books. Um, but what this doesn't, what I would say, what this doesn't, what you may be confused by is this term Ezrahite. If you have basic knowledge of the Bible, you may think that Ezrahite is like a descendant of the biblical Ezra, who is, if you'll note, an important figure whenever the Israelites returned from captivity at the start of the Second Temple period. I use the term Ezrahite here because that's the common term for these people. But a less confusing term might be Zarahite. It doesn't actually refer to the biblical Ezra at all. It refers to a completely different person who lived much earlier. Um, so really, Ethan and Heman are listed. These authors in the Book of Psalms are listed as contemporaries of David. And the sons of Korah, of course, being a tribe, or not really a tribe, but a clan, rather than an individual, obviously they could be contemporary to David as well. So whenever we look at the Masoretic version of the attribution of the Psalms, um, you'll note here that all of the authors in the Masoretic version were either contemporaries of David, anonymous, or in the case of Moses, existed long before the time of David. So that is basically your first indication that the whole book of Psalms could be written during the time of David. All of the authors explicitly mentioned are contemporaries of David. So, now that we've got that out of the way, all of these Psalms could have been written during the time of David. That does not mean they are. Just a quick overview. You will see quite clearly that in the first three books, almost every single psalm has an author attributed to it. In the last two books, the situation essentially entirely reverses, and almost every psalm almost every psalm is anonymous. It doesn't have an author attributed to it. So, what's going on here? Is it really the case that these two books are original, or were they added later? So, I don't want to get into the debate of whether or not they were added later, but I will just say that the idea that they were added later, it's not preposterous, but I don't think it is true. Um, the what's important to note here is that according to the critical view, um, the songs of ascent, which are directly related, which are used when the Israelites journeyed to the temple, it is believed by many critical scholars that this is a separate psalter altogether, and that this was used, and that the fifth book of Psalms was essentially constructed around it. I am, as again, I'm not sure if I agree with that view, um, but it is weird that you have a that the Song of Ascents is like part of Book Five rather than its own distinct book. Um, that can, of course, be potentially explained by the fact that whenever you know you say book one, book two, book three, book four, and book whenever you have multiple books with ancient writings, what that generally means is that they were written on different scrolls. So the fact that the Songs of Ascent happen to be written on the same scroll as all of these other psalms can explain why they're part of the same book. But it is weird, um, to, if I'm being completely honest, and the fact that there's this sub psalter within Book Five, I think does lend credence to the idea that much of Book Five specifically was written later. Um, but what parts of Book Five? I'm not going to get into that because ultimately, when it comes down to it, I I do think these were all written by David, uh, during the time of David, not by David. I think the Moses Psalm was written by Moses. As for these anonymous psalms, generally my view is if one version attributes it to David, I will take it as being a Davidic psalm. But if nobody attributes it to David, then I don't really think there's a reason to do so. A lot of these psalms are probably it. It makes sense that David would have included songs that were traditionally used by the Israelites already into this hymnal that he was using for the temple. So I don't think the idea. I think it makes sense that there would be some anonymous psalms in the Book of Psalms, and David chose to place it in the latter books, rather than in the former books. Um, I think that's all it really comes down to. Um, but there is a possibility that books 4 and 5 were added later, were developed later than the time of David, and I don't think that is really contrary to scripture or faith in any way. The only thing I would have to say there is that you would have to say that yes, there were other Psalms of David that were not contained in the original book of Psalms that were added later by the people who compiled the later books. And I don't think that's wild. Um, then, finally, before we get on to Psalm numbering, I want to talk about the Apocryphal Psalms because there are 5 of them. They are not in any modern Bible because they are not canonical. But one of them was included in many copies of the Septuagint translation as a supernumerary psalm. It wasn't listed as 151 because if it was, that would indicate that it was canonical. It was simply included in the scroll without a number to indicate its apocryphal status. So that's Psalm 151. And also, the Qumran community had that psalm and four additional psalms, all numbered, that they added to their own version of the book of Psalms. And just that's what this is here. But this is not in the Masoretic, 151 through 155. It's just in the Holy Land and in the Hebrew language rather than Greek, which is why I put it under the Masoretic column. Anyways, now, psalm numbering. What you'll notice um, is that there are four cases where one version of the Book of Psalms uh, considers two psalms to be joined together, and the other version considers them to be separate. And if and there are other, and it swaps between them. Eventually, um, they every version of the Book of Psalms, except the ones that add these extra psalms, has exactly 150. And they don't remove psalms, they don't add them to get there. They just combine and divide psalms to get there. And that is very interesting. And I think this is probably the strongest piece of evidence that the whole thing was written by King David. Because when it comes down to it, if people disagreed about the chapter divisions of the Psalms, you would expect them to also disagree about the number of Psalms in the text. You would expect there to be a version that, divides where all of these psalms that are joined together. You would expect there to be a version that divides all of them, which would total which would get you to 152 psalms. And you might also expect a version that unifies psalms that aren't normally unified, bringing it down to maybe 149, 148, 147. You would expect there to be some variance in the amount of psalms, but you see that there is exactly 150 in both the Hebrew and Septuagint. And I think it's fair to ask why. And I think it's important to note here the reason why there is 150 probably has to do with the fact that the Psalms were originally divided into 150 chapters by the original authors. This is 150 songs compiled together. So, what that looks like to me is that everyone who is making different versions of the Book of Psalms is trying to hit a target number. They are trying to get exactly this many psalms in there. Certain psalms may look to them like they should be split apart, but they bring them together because if they split them apart, well, we'll have more psalms than we need. And certain psalms look like they should be combined, but they stay separated because if we combine them, well, we'll get fewer psalms than we need. We need 150 because they know there are 150 psalms. And I don't think this 150 number would be so important that every version of the Book of Psalms would try to hit it, unless there were originally 150 psalms when the book was written. And So what that indicates to me is that this was written by King David, who intended for there to be 150 psalms. So now there is the real question, well, which version has the right list of 150 psalms? And in order to do that, we will need to actually read through and understand the decision to divide particular psalms in two. So, the psalms that are disputed are um, are all listed here. You will see that there is one in book one, and there are three different uh, disputes in book five. So they're all in book one or book five. Book two, three, and four, everyone agrees about how those are divided in their entirety. So let's start with book one, Psalm 9, which is 9 in the Septuagint, but is 9 and 10 in the Masoretic. So here in this Dewey Rames Bible that I have online, they just have the whole thing joined together. So I'm going to go to another version in order to read them as separate. Okay, I had to get it onto the Psalm page. Alright, so let's start reading these disputed Psalms. So, Psalm 9, um, to the tune of the death of the Son, a Psalm of David. I will give thanks to you, Lord, with all my heart. I will tell of all your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing the praises of your name, O Most High. My enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before you. For you have upheld my right and my cause, sitting enthroned as the righteous judge. You have rebuked the nations and destroyed the wicked. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. Endless ruin has overtaken my enemies. You have uprooted their cities. Even the memory of them has perished. The Lord reigns forever. He has established his throne for judgment. He rules the world in righteousness and judges the people with equity. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. Sing to the Lord, sing the praises of the Lord enthroned in Zion. Proclaim among the nations what he has done. For he who avenges blood remembers, he does not ignore the cries of the afflicted. Lord, see how my enemies persecute me. Have mercy and lift me up from the gates of death, that I may declare your praises in the gates of daughter Zion, and there rejoice in your salvation. The nations have fallen into the pit they have dug. Their feet are caught in the net they have hidden. The Lord is known by his acts of justice. The wicked are ensnared by the work of their hands. The wicked go down to the realm of the dead, all the nations that forget God. But God will never forget the needy. The hope of the afflicted will never perish. Arise, Lord, do not let mortals triumph. Let the nations be judged in your presence. Strike them with terror, Lord. Let the nations know they are only mortal. Then remember, Psalm 10 is considered to be the same psalm in the Septuagint. Why, Lord, do you stand afar off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? In his arrogance, the wicked man hunts down the weak, who are caught in the schemes he devises. He boasts about the cravings of his heart. He blesses the greedy and reviles the Lord. In his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. His ways are always prosperous. Your laws are rejected by him. He sneers at all his enemies. He says to himself, nothing will ever shake me. He swears, no one will ever do me harm. His mouth is full of lies and threats. Trouble and evil are under his tongue. He lies in wait near the villages. From ambush he murders the innocent. His eyes watch in secret for his victims. Like a lion in cover, he lies in wait. He lies in wait to catch the helpless. He catches the helpless and drags them off in his net. His victims are crushed, they collapse. They fall under his strength. He says to himself, God will never notice. He covers his face and never sees. Arise, Lord, lift up your hands, O God. Do not forget the helpless. Why does the wicked man revile God? Why does he say to himself, he won't call me to account? But you, God, see the trouble of the afflicted. You consider their grief and take it in hand. The victims commit themselves to you. You are the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked man. Call the evildoer to account for his wickedness, that would not otherwise be found out. The Lord is king forever and ever. The nations will perish from his land. You, Lord, hear the desire of the afflicted. You encourage them, and you listen to their cry, defending the fatherless and the oppressed, so that mere earthly mortals will never again strike terror. And as you can see, there are 39 verses in Psalm 9, which is more than the sum of the verses in the Masoretic version. And you'll also see that Psalm 10 has no author attributed. Um, and here we have some evidence that uh, they are uh, one psalm because they were, according to this, a single acrostic poem. Um, and if you have an acrostic theme, um, actually, let's look at the Hebrew. So Sepharia, let's go to the book of Psalms, Psalm 9, and let's see. I just want the Hebrew this time. Source. So here we have Aleph, Bet, Gamma, Daleth. Okay. And then Aleph. Okay. I I can't read Hebrew, but uh okay, so the Hebrews must use letters for verse numbers because obviously that's 9, right? I need to. Okay, no, I'm on 5. 9. Okay, source. Source with translation. So, a Psalm of David. Okay. Give ear to my speech, O Eternal One. Yeah, that's Aleph right there. Consider my heed the sound. So, Hebrew alphabet. That's related text. Don't need relating text. Well, I don't know if it's an acrostic poem or not. Oh, I'm on the wrong psalm again. So Psalm 9, Aleph, Aleph, Bet. Then humble to their doom at your presence. I mean, I don't know where lines begin and end. This is becoming useless. Okay. Now let's move to Psalm 114. So after Psalm 9, the Septuagint version is obviously going to be behind the Hebrew version. Specifically, this means that whenever, for Psalms after Psalm 9, if I say, Psalm 11 and I'm talking about the Hebrew version, I actually mean Psalm 10 when I'm talking about the Greek version, and so on and so forth, all the way until you get to Psalm 113, at least in the Greek version, because the Greek 113 is actually Psalm 114 and 115 in the Hebrew version. And you'll also note that Psalm 114 and 115 in the Greek are Psalm 116 in the Hebrew. So you'll note both of the combined psalms in the Greek version are come first, and then the Hebrew version will combine psalms to get to 150. What this means is that for most of the book of Psalms, both before and after 113, the book of Psalms, the Greek is one behind the Hebrew. But in 113 specifically, it's two behind. Specifically in the section of 113, which is considered 115 in the Hebrew, and in the section of and in 114, which is the first part of 116 in the Hebrew, it is two behind. So it's briefly really far behind, two behind, but most of the time it's just one behind. So let's look at Psalms 114 and 115 in the Hebrew to see why it is split into two Psalms. So for Psalm 9 and 10, I can see that the change in theme would obviously make it reasonable to split the psalm. And let's look at Psalm 114 and 115. When Israel came out of Egypt, Jacob from a people of foreign tongue, Judah became God's sanctuary, Israel his dominion. The sea looked and fled, the Jordan turned back, the mountains leaped like rams, the hills like lambs. Why was it sea that you fled? Why, Jordan, did you turn back? Why, mountains, did you leap like rams, you hills like lambs? Tremble, earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob, who turned the rock into a pool, the hard rock into springs of water. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name be the glory, because of your love and faithfulness. Why to the nations say, where is their God? Our God is in heaven, he does whatever pleases him. But their idols are silver and gold, made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. All you Israelites trust in the Lord, he is their help and their shield. House of Aaron, trust in the Lord, he is their help and their shield. You who fear him, trust in the Lord, he is their help and their shield. The Lord remembers us and will bless us. He will bless his people Israel. He will bless the house of Aaron. He will bless the Lord those who fear him, small and great alike. May the Lord cause you to flourish, both you and your children. May you be blessed by the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to mankind. It is not the dead who praise the Lord, those who go down to the place of silence. It is we who extol the Lord, both now and forevermore. Praise the Lord. Okay. So you can also, I think, see why these psalms are two different psalms in the Hebrew version. One of them is really exultant about it's really about the Exodus, and the other one is a more general theological dissertation on how God is different from the idols. But I can also see why these are joined into one psalm in the Greek version. After all, the Psalm 115 seems to clarify the intent of Psalm 114, whereas Psalm 114 could potentially be read on its own as a psalm of glory to Israel. It's Psalm 115 specifies it is not to glorify Israel, but the God who saved Israel, that we rejoice at our exodus and at the conquest. So this also indicates to me that, you know, these were probably one psalm originally. But let's look at Psalm 116 and see why it is split and why it is joined together in the different versions. I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. Then I called on the name of the Lord. Lord, save me. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Now, I believe that this is where the psalm ends in the Septuagint. Let me check. Yes. Yes, that is where it ends. So, that is, according to the Septuagint, one complete psalm. And this second section, from verse 10 to the end, is Psalm 115 in the Septuagint. I trusted in the Lord when I said, I am greatly afflicted. In my alarm I said, everyone is a liar. What shall I return to the Lord for all his goodness to me? I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants. Truly I am your servant, Lord. I serve you just as my mother did. You have freed me from my chains. I will sacrifice a thank offering to you, and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all this people, in the courts of the house of the Lord, in your midst, O Jerusalem. Alright, so I can see why this is joined together, because uh, these two sections are very thematically similar. Whereas in the previous psalm, Psalm 114 and 115 Hebrew, 113 Greek, the two sections were very different thematically. But, it kind of does restart in verse 10. I don't know. Psalm 147. So let's just go to Psalm 147, which, if we look at where exactly that ends, the Lord takes pleasure in them that fear him and in them that hope in his mercy. So that should be verse 11. Yep. So Psalm 147, verses 1 through 11, is 146 in the Septuagint, and 12 to the end is 147 in the Septuagint. So, praise the Lord. How good it is to sing praises to our God, how pleasant and fitting to praise him. The Lord builds up Jerusalem, he gathers the exiles of Israel. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. He determines the number of the stars and calls them each by name. Great is our Lord and mighty in power, his understanding has no limit. The Lord sustains the humble, but casts the wicked to the ground. Sing to the Lord with grateful praise. Make music to our God on the harp. He covers the sky with clouds. He supplies the earth with rain, and makes grass grow on the hills. He provides food for the cattle, and for the young ravens when they call. His pleasure is not in the strength of the horse, nor his delight in the legs of the warrior. The Lord delights in those who fear him. who put their hope in his unfailing love. Extol the Lord, Jerusalem. Pray, um, put their hope in unfailing love. Extol the Lord, Jerusalem. Praise your God, Zion. This is Psalm 147. He strengthens the bars of your gates and blesses your people within you. He grants peace to your borders and satisfies you with the finest of wheat. He sends his command to the earth, his word runs swiftly. He spreads the snow like wool and scatters the hoarfrost like ashes. He hurls down his hail like pebbles. Who can withstand his icy blast? He sends his word and melts them. He stirs up his breezes, and the waters flow. He has revealed his word to Jacob, his laws and decrees to Israel. He has done this for no other nation. They do not know his laws. Praise the Lord. Okay, so this is um so it can be difficult to tell that uh Psalm 12 is supposed to be uh Psalm 146 and 147. And Psalm 147 is supposed to be split in two because again they are thematically similar. The issue is that in this later section, um, after the Song of Ascents, essentially all of these psalms are called psalms of praise or alleluias. They begin with very explicit praise to God, most of them. And because of that, in these later alleluias, um, they're all fairly thematically similar. Um, but the way that you can tell that one psalm is different from the other is that every single one of these psalms begins with some acclamation like Alleluia or Praise the Lord. Or, yeah, it begins with the acclamation Alleluia. And that, or Praise the Lord, it's the differences are minor. But, and most of them also end with a praise. So the way that you know that Psalm 146 and 147 are supposed to be different is that there is this extol the Lord Jerusalem, praise your God Zion inserted in the middle of this psalm right here. And in this section, this is normally used to end or begin a psalm, not as an interjection in the middle. So yeah, these are definitely two separate psalms. So, now that we have read through all of the psalms, and this is the first time I've actually done that, so this is kind of my first reaction, my first judgment on whether or not these psalms should be separate or not. But having read through these psalms, yeah, I would say that the Septuagint is probably the correct version. Um, the verse 10 right here, I can read it as a restart. Of course, there is a difficulty where you have Psalm 114 and 115 being so different thematically, but, you know, the reason why it is actually important to divide the Psalms in the correct way ultimately comes down to the fact that um, each psalm has a particular message. Each, and if you think that a psalm ends when it actually continues, that can change what the psalm means. And if you think that the psalm continues when it actually ends, that can also change what the psalm means. So, just for example, let's look at Psalm 9 and 10. If you think that the psalm ends with Arise, Lord, do not let mortals triumph. Let the nations be judged in your presence. Strike them with terror, Lord. Let the nations know they are only mortal. Then Psalm 9 is what you would call an imprecatory psalm. And then, and that's where it ends. And Psalm 10 seems like it's starting with doubt and building up faith over time. But if you combine them together, as the Septuagint does, the message changes. The meaning of the psalm changes to where instead of Psalm 9 being an imprecatory psalm, you see how there is this starting, you see how the psalm in the Septuagint, it starts with boldness rather than doubt. And then, after being um, after being confident, expressing confidence in God for a long time, suddenly there's doubt. So instead of beginning with doubt and coming to understand God, instead of the David of Psalm 10 starting in doubt and learning to be the David of Psalm 9, what you instead see with this longer Psalm 9 is a David that has zeal, then comes to doubt, and then comes to a fuller understanding of God. So you can see how combining or separating the Psalms in this case changes the message. And again, if we look at Psalm 114 or 113, if, in the Masoretic, the Psalm 114 ends right here at verse 8, who turned the rock into pools and the stony hills into the fountains of water. Psalm 114 becomes an exaltation and just this rejoicing at the Exodus. But the meaning of this rejoicing is clarified in Psalm 115. If they're two separate, um, if they're two separate psalms, then the fact that this statement, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to thy name give glory," no longer becomes a clarification. And also, with Psalm 115 starting here, "Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to thy name give glory," what are we giving God the glory for? If we combine the Psalms, it's clear that we're giving God glory for the Exodus. And again, Psalm 114 and 115. These are very similar in theme, but they kind of restart. I have loved the Lord. I have loved because the Lord will hear the voice of my prayer. I have believed, therefore have I spoken, but I have been humbled exceedingly. Um, the basically, if you combine the two psalms, the trajectory is much rockier, whereas if you separate them, the trajectory of both psalms is kind of straightforward and ascendant. Um, you go in Psalm 114, where the sorrows of death have compassed me and the perils of hell have found me, to I will please the Lord in the land of the living. If it's combined with the next psalm, you jump from I will please the Lord in the land of the living to, um, let's just go to Psalm 116 because the Douay-Rheims can be hard sometimes. I trusted in the Lord when I said I am greatly afflicted. In my alarm I said everyone is a liar. And then it says, I will sacrifice a thank offering to you and call on the name of the Lord. I will fulfill my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord in your midst, O Jerusalem. The trajectory goes like in Psalm 116 goes up, then down, then up, then down. As I was saying, yeah, Psalms 116 kind of restarts its trajectory if you combine it together. Okay, but I guess those are my reasons for why I think um, that the Septuagint numbering is probably correct. Uh, of course, the same reasons that I would want to split up Psalm 116 could also cause me to split up Psalms 9 and 10. But I guess that argument works both ways. Okay, whatever. That is my autistic ramblings about the Book of Psalms. And it is about time for me to just be done with this rant. So yeah, those are the Book of Psalms. I hope you learned something from this. Oh,